Welcome to our podcast, where we uncover the most extraordinary stories hidden in the depths of time and mystery. Today, I invite you to journey into the heart of an abandoned quarry, where a team of unsuspecting workers stumbled upon something that defies belief. What began as a simple task to clear debris quickly turned into the discovery of a lifetime. A metallic shimmer buried beneath the earth, a hidden tunnel long forgotten, and echoes of lives trapped in time. What secrets does this place hold? And what fate awaited those who vanished decades ago? Stay with us as we unravel this astonishing tale. You won't want to miss a single moment. A digging crew stumbled upon something unbelievable when reinstating a local quarry. The large hole had been neglected for well over 2 decades, but when the need for stone rose again, this team was sent on a mission to clear out the rubble and make it operational again. However, they quickly stumbled upon something they shouldn't have found when they started digging. With a massively growing housing market, the need for stone increased tremendously over the last couple of years. So old quarries like this needed to be reinstated fast. But there was one big problem, and that problem arose fairly quickly after they started delving. It took the team about 2 days to clear all the loose debris and overgrowth from the quarry. But on the 3rd day, the team hit a major roadblock, quite literally. The digging crane was down in the quarry, and with it, the team had already started deepening and expanding the quarry walls. Dirt and rock were broken off and removed, but then a deafening sound was heard at the front of the crane. It sounded like a loud clang, the kind you get when metal hits metal. The workers all laid down their gear and started running over to the hole created by the crane. When the team looked into the hole, they saw a metallic, shimmering surface facing them. It was yellowish in color, but other than that, it was hard to make out what it was. Carl ordered his crew to pick up shovels and smaller drilling equipment to excavate the object from the ground. At first, the team only saw a speckle of yellow metal, but they quickly noticed that the object was far larger than they had imagined. When the edges of the metallic object were cleared, they saw that it was at least 5 feet in diameter. After a little more digging around the object, the team used their high-powered crane to do the rest of the lifting. The object was also at least 6 feet deep. With the object removed from the ground, Carl and his team circled it as it stood between them. The metal was very corroded from being in the ground for so long, but it was clear to see the details of this mysterious object. There were doors on both sides, and Carl pulled on the handle of the first one. To his surprise, it opened up. The crew leader stood inside the object. It was a weird doorway about 3 feet deep, with a clear entrance and exit door. He knew that this was a tunnel door. They used it to strengthen tunnels, holding up tons of ground above while providing passage through dugout areas. Carl opened the door on the exit side this time, seeing his curious team again as he left the object. They were still locked onto the object, wondering what it was, but Carl instantly walked past them as he stared into the hole from which they retrieved the tunnel door. Carl stared into the deep hole their crane had created and quickly saw an image that confirmed his suspicion. Carl took a deep breath as he looked into the dark mouth of the tunnel. "All right, we're going in," he said, a hint of both caution and excitement in his voice. He signaled for the team to grab their flashlights. Even though they were a bit more hesitant than he was, one by one, they all obliged and followed Carl into the dark unknown below. Carl led the way. The walls were even more corroded than the doorway, indicating that this place had been untouched for decades. Dust and cobwebs filled the air as they proceeded. The tunnel walls, however, were unnaturally clean-cut, suggesting that this tunnel was either made by a tunneling master years ago or maintained throughout its years of existence. Several crew members decided they'd had enough. One of them, a younger guy named Mark, muttered, "I'm not staying down here another second," and turned back. The others nodded in agreement, fear written across their faces. The group's footsteps echoed as they scrambled away. Carl did not try to stop them, as he understood their worry. He just watched as their bobbing flashlights faded into the distance. After the dust settled, Carl and only 5 other crew members remained inside the tunnel. They were alone in the dark, but determined to press on. Carl told his team to stay strong together. They had come this far, and he wasn't about to turn back without understanding what they had discovered. "All right, if you want to stay, stick close. We're finding out what's in here," he said, while pointing his flashlight to the road ahead. As they proceeded, the tunnel seemed to narrow slightly, and the beams reinforcing it grew closer together. Carl also noticed that there were colored markings on the beams, all in the same shape but in a different shade. Carl couldn't shake the feeling that they were being led somewhere, almost as if the tunnel itself was designed for them to follow. And Carl wasn't far off with this assessment. "Let's move quietly," he whispered as they edged further. The tunnel took a sharp turn, and as they rounded it, they were greeted with an astonishing sight. It was an underground chamber larger than the ground floor of Carl's own house. The team crawled through the narrow opening of the tunnel, and now all of them marveled as they moved through the spacious room. Scribbly drawings were etched into the rocky walls all around them, and recognizable tools were leaning against the side of the cave-like room. They were old but looked well-maintained. "What is this place, and why is all of this down here?" one crew member asked Carl, hoping he would have the answer. But Carl simply shrugged his shoulders. Carl walked toward a pile of tools and brushed away some dust and dirt, revealing a symbol on the equipment. His brow lifted because it was a mark he vaguely recognized, but from where? There wasn't much time to ponder this finding. There wasn't, because shortly after, a sound was heard again, and this time it was accompanied by footsteps. It was clear that whatever caused these sounds was getting closer, because the footsteps that were first heard in the far distance quickly grew louder and louder. Carl's crew exchanged nervous glances, not wanting to get caught somewhere they did not belong. Carl and his team crouched low behind some large boulders, dimming their flashlights to avoid detection. They held their breath as a group of elderly men, all dressed in old work clothes, shuffled into the large chamber. Each man appeared to be at least 60 years old, with silver hair and weathered faces. Carl and his crew exchanged puzzled glances. "Who are they?" one of Carl's men whispered. The group of elderly men seemed oblivious to the hidden crew watching them. They went about their routine, lighting more lanterns placed around the room. As the chamber grew brighter, Carl and his team saw makeshift beds, worn but functional, made from old metal carts and other mining equipment. One of Carl's crew members, unable to contain his shock, let out a small gasp. Unfortunately, the gasp was loud enough to catch the attention of the elderly men. As a response, one of the men snapped his head toward the dark corner where Carl's team was hiding. "Who's there?" the man called out sternly. Carl signaled his team to stay still, but it was too late. They were heard. Slowly, the man began walking toward the spot where Carl and his team were crouched. Carl quickly turned, and together with his team, ran back into the tunnel from which they had entered. Their footsteps were swift, and without being caught, they reached the first bend in the tunnel, a checkpoint it felt like. But before they could maneuver past it, they were halted by the old man's voice. "Stop! We mean you no harm," one of the men called out. Carl halted, finding the tone of this man's voice far removed from a threat. He turned his face and saw that the man with the lantern remained standing at the end of the tunnel opening. He had no intention of following Carl and his crew, and suddenly seemed harmless. Carl addressed his teammates, saying he felt that they should go back to the man. "We came here to discover what was down here, so let's find out together." His team carefully agreed, and together they walked back to the open space. Once there, the elderly man raised his lantern higher, illuminating Carl and his crew as they stood frozen, unsure what to do. "We just want to talk," the old man said. There was no malice in his voice, just a gentle invitation. Carl looked at his team, and together they cautiously stepped into the light. The rest of the elderly men had retreated to their makeshift beds, resuming their quiet routine. The man with the lantern approached Carl, extending his hand in greeting. "My name is John," he said. "How did you find this place?" Carl explained how they had been working at the quarry above, clearing rubble and debris when they hit an old tunnel door. John's eyes widened instantly after Carl told him this, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. His fellow cavemen looked alarmed too by this revelation. "After all these years," John murmured, shaking his head in disbelief. John started to cry, which surprised Carl and his crew, but the old man had a good reason for this. John saw Carl and his crew's confused faces and promised to explain the situation. The story that he revealed then was the craziest thing Carl had ever heard. John and the other men down here were part of a mining crew that had worked in this very place decades ago. This used to be an active mine, and a large one at that. We were digging deep when an earthquake hit. It shifted the ground and collapsed almost all the tunnels. He paused, the memory clearly painful. Most of the workers made it out, but we got trapped down here. At first we did our best digging ourselves out from within, but we quickly discovered that it was impossible with our equipment down here. Then we waited, hoping someone would come for us, but no one did. We guessed that the collapse was too severe, and that after not being able to reach this deep down, we were presumed dead. Over time, we realized that no rescue was coming. We were stuck, and this became our home. We've been stuck down here for well over 30 years, all forgotten about, but still very much alive. A tear rolled down the poor man's cheek. It was a heartbreaking story. John explained that they had survived all these years on stored provisions. There were enough canned goods down here to feed an entire mining operation for years, he said, but with only 8 of us, the food supply could last us a lifetime. We rationed and ate rice and beans every day. We would not starve, but loneliness was our biggest enemy. Carl shook his head in disbelief. That was over 30 years ago, he said softly. And all this time, you've been down here? John nodded, his expression pure sadness. Yes, and we had no way of getting out. The tunnels were sealed off, and we couldn't dig our way out without risking a collapse. The room fell silent as Carl processed what John had just told him. The miners had spent 3 decades trapped underground, forgotten by the world above. But now, for the first time in 30 years, there was hope. This story was about to get a continuation after being halted for decades. With the help of Carl's crew, the 8 elderly miners were brought to the hospital where they got proper care. They stayed there for over 2 weeks for observation. After that, they were free men once more. Some miners still had family alive, and those reunions were emotional and heartwarming. For the first time in 30 years, the lost miners were united with loved ones. Even Carl, who never cried, wiped away a tear when he witnessed their embrace. We were just there to reinstate a quarry, and now we saved 8 lives. This is crazy. You can't make this stuff up, he said. News of the discovery spread quickly, and soon Carl and his crew were hailed as heroes. They made national news multiple times and were often asked to tell their story, but they didn't mind. The fact remained that these old miners were safe again, and families were happy. The mine was closed for good now, preventing further collapse, and a few months later, the quarry was successfully reinstated.